In this video, I wanted to show you some basic stuff about Adobe Animate and mainly how to create a static image. We don't need to get into animation as of yet. That can be covered in a later video, but at least here you can kind of get to understand and know the basic drawing tools in Adobe Animate. So the first thing I want to point out is when you go to Create New, right up here, there's actually some presets, some fast presets or templates that you can choose, and you could choose the full HD right here, which is what we're going to be working with. But if you go over to Create New, it's going to pull up a window that actually brings up a lot more templates, and it's divided into different sections like social, game, education, ads, web, and advanced. And you can change these settings. These are just basic presets or templates that you can use. Right now it's set to full HD because it's what I used last time. You might see this HD button over here, but it usually tries to sort of adjust to what you use the most. We're going to use this full HD, this 1920 by 1080, and it shows you that the frame rate's 30. It would have been the same if we chose this icon right here back in the background, but just to show you that you can kind of change things around, right? So I'm going to go ahead and click Create. What that's going to do is it's going to open up and give me basically an empty palette, an empty stage to look at. Adobe Animate calls things, Adobe Animate started off as Adobe Flash, and actually Macromedia Flash, for those, kind of knowing this back in the day. Adobe bought it. And then as Flash kind of matured and sort of was used on the web, it actually changed and modified, and I think they're trying to get back to the roots of Adobe Animate and make it more of an animation package. So they've rebranded it Adobe Animate. And so the original metaphor was this was like a theatrical production. So they called this area, this open white area, the stage rather than a scene. And you see it's called scene up here, but there's also other places where they call it a stage. So just kind of realize I like to refer to it as a scene because I think about it more of like animation. So one thing to think about, it looks like a big empty open canvas. And if you choose where it says 100% here, it zooms in. So you could choose fit to window, and that's the entire size of your stage. You can, zoom out a little bit more if you want to. And if you hold down the space bar, you can actually drag it with your hand without choosing, a tool to do that. So I'm just kind of dragging it around. It doesn't change where the stage is located. It just allows you to see things a little better. So when you kind of zoom in and use that space bar, it kind of moves it around. A couple things that talking about the whole layout of Adobe Animate. This, like I said, I call it the scene, but sometimes it's called the stage. And then over here is the library and properties panel. So the properties is going to be pretty useful. We're going to use this properties a lot right now because all we have is this empty stage or the scene. You're going to see that it says document, it says Untitled 2, which matches up here. When we name it, we save it, we name it, that's going to change, right? And it's got a couple different settings here. It shows 1920 by 1080 is the size, 1920 wide by 1080 high. That's the pixel size, pixel dimensions, and then it's 30 frames per second. So this really matches what a high definition television would have these days, like, the higher size of the higher HD. We don't want to go with that 720 HD because that's sort of the half the size. So we're going to start with this full HD size so it would fit on a modern high definition television, right? Same with the frame rate. Frame rate would be 30 frames per second. Down here, I'm going to move this up just a little bit and see if I can kind of grab. You got to get the mouse right in between these things, and I can pull this up and show you the timeline. We're not really going to be dealing with this much in my first video here, but in future videos we will. And you've got the transport controls and the frames. So right now, here's the stage. We're on frame 1. We don't have any subsequent frames. They're just empty. They're blank, right? I could add another one. We could add motion, but again, I just want to kind of talk about the paint tools and the drawing tools in Adobe Animate. And right here you see there's layer 1, and I can add multiple layers and put drawings on different layers just by clicking that new button, right? So I'm going to start with layer 1. A couple things to realize, even though these numbers are 1, 2, and 3, right now 3 would be the top, 2 would be below that, and 1 would be lower as you're looking down on it, right? So when you're looking in this area, whatever's in layer 3 at this point in time would be the topmost layer. Whenever I see in lower 1 would be the bottommost layer. There's other ways you can order things around in the stage, but this is kind of the easiest way, is to put them on different layers and move them around. So it doesn't matter what they're named. I can move layer 1 up here, it's at the top, and I can move layer 1 down here and it's at the bottom. And I'll show you that when I get into drawing. But I'm going to start with layer 1. And right here we have all the drawing tools. There's also some special options over here that we'll discuss later. But these are all the tools. And I find it being docked over here like this is not very beneficial. So I like to take this and move it out and move it over here, and then I can change the size of it, right? So I can, arrange that toolbox however I want to, right? I can make it nice and tall and thin, which I like it, have it floating, so I can kind of move it around and use it. I don't find it very useful to be down there on the bottom. When you first open up Adobe Animate, that's where it's docked. And if you change what you're doing on your own particular machine, it's going to stay that way every time you open it. You can reset that. You can go back to Essentials by clicking this, and it'll reset the Essentials. This is a workspace, and it's got a couple different workspaces. Plus you can, whatever you arrange, you can save your own. And I've got a future video that'll talk about that too. So I'm going to quickly go through some of the tools real quick and how to customize this toolbox, which is really super important. The first thing to realize is that Adobe Animate is a vector drawing program. So when I draw things out, and I'm just going to choose a basic shape, right? Just a circle for whatever reason. It's going to have both a line and a fill. And so that was this oval tool. And I'm going to click and I'm going to hold on this, and I'm going to go to what's called the sub-selection tool. You'll see that there's a little A right there. If I press A on the keyboard, that's the shortcut to get to that sub-selection tool. And there's the selection tool. But I'm going to show you the sub-selection tool first, just to kind of point something out. You'll see there's points along this outline, this circle. If I click one of those points and I drag it around, that allows me to manipulate this shape, which is a line and a fill for this particular drawing that I started with just this, just kind of using an oval, right? And then I can manipulate the handles. I can take the handles and I can drag them out. Animate is really super precise. If you've ever used a program like Adobe Illustrator, it's very similar to that. It's unlike Photoshop. Photoshop does have some what they call Bezier tools, but when you just go in and paint in Photoshop, you're dealing with pixels and not vectors like Adobe Animate has. And it's got some things that you could do to kind of blend the two, but just so you realize, it's making a shape, and that shape is filled in, right? It's got a line. And then if I select one of these points and I just delete it, I can kind of get rid of those points, right? So this is how I can kind of manipulate certain drawing. And again, if you've ever used Illustrator, you'll realize that it's a lot closer to Illustrator than Photoshop. So I can kind of manipulate these shapes based on these vectors, right, with these Bezier handles, right, just to kind of point that out. So there's two selection tools, like I kind of alluded to. There's a sub-selection tool and a selection tool. I'm going to go to the selection tool, and I'm going to show you that. When you select that, when you click on that, you can actually select the outline. So it has, you'll notice here, it has kind of this bluish looking outline. That's the outline color, and this right here is the shape color, right, in the fill. So you've got a line and a fill, and if I double click it, I can select the whole thing. If I just click once on the fill area and drag it over, I'm going to separate it from its outline. Now these are both independent at this point in time. If I drag it out there, they are both now independent shapes. So I can manipulate this outline shape by moving the lines around, the points around, right? I can also kind of drag it around just by selecting on the outline. And if I go over to this one, I still have little points along that I can kind of manipulate. So just to be extra careful, just when you're drawing and doing things, if you choose this selection tool, right, you can select things and break them apart, right? So you're going to have this outline and the fill, right? Typically when I'm drawing, I don't draw with a line and a fill. I just go ahead and on the fill or on the outline, I turn it off, right? That's how you can kind of turn it off. You choose this little square that has a little red line through it. And so now if I were to paint and actually turned off my shape, let me get that back on. Choose the selection tool. I'm going to go back and make it a different color just so you can kind of see. So these, whatever I have selected, these are going to change. These color swatches are going to change whatever I've selected. So if I select that, if I choose this inner color, let me click back off. If I choose this inner color, right, it didn't have a fill because I moved the fill away. Now it's just an outline. So I have to go and make sure that that outline is on if I want to see it. I gotta get it selected. So it's probably all gone now. Let's see if I can, yep, I probably ended up deleting it there. But just so you realize that I can't, this no longer, when I move that around off of its original shape, so that's the original shape, it has both a line and a fill. And if I choose the selection tool, not the sub-selection tool, the selection tool, and click in the middle, and I don't double click, then I can move it away from its outline. So I'm going to undo. If you double click, then it'll move it with its outline. And again, I do not usually use an outline. You can also go over to the properties over here. If it says object, you can actually see the fill and the stroke. I can actually choose the stroke, and I can turn it off by choosing that little line, and then it's gone, right? You also see it's over here. Now, it's hard to add that back in, right? I'm going to just select it once, and you'll notice there's no outline that's associated with it anymore, right? But I'm going to select it once, move it around. You'll see that it doesn't have an outline. Even if I go over here, I can see that it doesn't have a stroke. It just has a fill. Now, what you can do is there's other tools to kind of get it back, but I'll talk about that in a bit. One thing you can do, I always find it annoying that you have to select this and kind of to select between the two. If you understand and you use the keystrokes or the shortcuts, you can actually choose that shortcut and kind of quickly get to that tool. But if you like to see all your tools in the toolbar, these three little dots, if you click that, it's going to bring up an edit, you're editing the toolbox with this, right? So what I can do is I can actually, once I'm in the edit mode, it says drag and drop tools, I can actually just click this and drag it over, and I can rearrange it. I can move it over here. If I put it back over on top of the icon, it's going to combine them again. So I can kind of drag them out to manipulate that. Now, once I close this window, once I select that, I'm not editing it, I'm choosing that tool, right? So I'm going to kind of drag this out a little bit more. And I'll talk about these. So there I have, if you hover over it, you should see it says the sub-selection tool, and that's the selection tool. For me, my purposes, I like to have the sub-selection over here because I feel like this is sort of more in general selecting things, and this is less. This is more specific in selecting things. It's kind of the idea behind these two tools, right? And then here we have the transform tool, right? If you hover over it, you're going to see, there we go, free transform tool, right? And then that allows you to kind of manipulate your shape using this bounding box that's around it. You can stretch it, you can, scrunch it down, you can scale it out, This is an actual pivot point. If you move this pivot point over here, it's going to scale from that pivot point. You kind of see that. So if I want to manipulate a shape just by scaling it or, skewing it, because you can drag this and move it up and down. So I can manipulate a shape that way. And then these are selection tools. So right now it's a polygon selection tool. If I press and hold, there's a lasso selection tool. I find the lasso selection tool to be a little bit, it's a little bit more beneficial because you could sort of drag around things and select something and then say break it apart if you want to. Or I can do that and press delete, and I can, delete things that I lassoed around, right? If I want to kind of manipulate my shape that way, if I want to make it look like it was kind of cut out or etched out in some way, like I can manipulate it that way, right? Make some weird shapes that way. And then much later, we're going to be talking about this asset warp tool. But I don't typically like the polygon tool. I think for some people it kind of works, but it ends up, you have to click and then click again and click again and click again to make a selection, right? You got to get right there at the end, or then just hit delete, right? So usually I have to be so precise that it gets right to the very beginning, and then you can delete and get rid of a portion of that, right? So these are basically selection tools up here, except for the asset warp, which is a little bit different. And I have a different video that kind of discusses how to use the asset warp tool, right? And down below are more like brushes and shapes, right? So this one right here is the fluid brush. You can actually see it over here. When you select the brush, you can see it in the properties. When it says tool, you can see that it says the fluid brush, and it's got a bunch of different settings. Now with this brush, it's kind of cool. It's fairly new in 2020 in Animate 2020, and that when you brush, it actually gives you a path. And so I'm gonna make the size a little bit bigger. These are all paths. These are all, again, shapes, just like have point and fill, right? Lines and fill. But this one acts more like a paintbrush, right? So you can kind of see that it's, gets a little thick and thin at spots. But if you go to the sub-selection tool and you select them, you'll notice that, and I'm going to zoom into this here, you'll notice that it has a bunch of points, right? And I'm going to change the color of this because I want you to be able to see the path. So I'm going to change that to say, I need to select it. I'm going to select it this way. Double click, and then I'm going to choose, say, that color, right? And then go back to the sub-selection tool. Now you can see these points a little bit better. By the way, the color of this path is decided by this little swatch right here. You can select that swatch, double click that swatch and change the color of it if you want to, but we'll talk about that later as well. But just so you know, I'm going to go to these points and I can manipulate and move them around. I can even delete some if I wanted to. Sometimes I find it's better just to drag across them, but sometimes it gets dangerous because you can drag across multiple ones, but I can delete them and then modify that shape if I wanted to, right? So I'm going to go to plus. Right, so that's this fluid brush, right? There's a lot of other capabilities in the fluid brush that we'll kind of get into later, but you've got this curve smoothing, right? That when you paint on it, if I bring the curve smoothing down, right, and I look at the points, you notice there's a whole bunch of them, right? I'm going to go back to the fluid brush, and I'm going to bring up the curve smoothing, and I'm going to do that, bring here, right? A lot less points, right? Notice that it's, when I choose that curve smoothing, when it's way up to the top, it actually makes less points, but you can see like this makes, like it's going to seem like it's a little more rough because it's got so many points, it's trying to manipulate that. And I actually like having the fewer points as possible as long as I can get the idea of the shape, right? So you can kind of play around with these different settings here. The size is sort of the big thing. That's sort of the overall size. If you have any pressure sensitivity, like you're using a tablet that's got pressure sensitivity, or you're using, like a Wacom Cintiq or a Wacom Intuos tablet, that size is the largest size, and the more you press down, the larger it gets, and the lighter you press down. Right? If you're doing that with a mouse, it doesn't necessarily do any kind of pressure sensitivity, but it does do some tapering. So if you want to kind of close that size down, I'm doing this with a mouse, you can actually change kind of the taper at the ends, so you can kind of get something like that if you want. So anyway, just playing around with that. I'm not really making a photo right now or an image that, I really would like. I'm just kind of playing around with the tools just so you can kind of see that, right? There's a lot of other abilities right here. One thing to kind of note is if you do have a tablet, make sure use pressure is on, right? And you'll see that pressure appear right here. You can, let's see, keep the brush mode. You can change it to just paint normal, paint fills, paint behind. There's a lot of other options, and you kind of play around with that. Make sure that you're not in the object drawing mode. So make sure that is off. So if it is not sort of grayed, it is off. So I'll show you the difference between the two. If it's like that and you paint, when I select that with this tool, you'll notice that I can select it as sort of a shape, right? And if I go back and I turn that on, go to the tool and I turn that back on, and then I paint with it. And then I paint with it. Now when I go and select it, you're going to have a box around it. Now that box is an element sitting on there that if you want to modify it, you have to double click to edit it and do that. It's a little bit harder, right, to kind of go through. So I always turn that off, right? So again, it's when I select that tool, if you see the fluid brush, if you see one of these buttons is highlighted, it's turned on. If it's not, when it looks like that, it's turned off, right? So now when I paint with that, you're going to see that when I select it with the sub-selection tool, I can get to the points and I don't see that box around it, right? The only reason why, like I said, is that it makes it a separate drawing element. And if you're drawing a whole bunch of these, you're going to have multiple drawing elements. Then you have to double click them to edit them rather than just editing them right here on the stage, right? The next brush is the classic brush. And the classic brush, this has been part of Adobe Animate or Adobe Flash for a while. But when you draw with this tool, what happens is you're going to see that it's not just, it doesn't have the same capabilities as the fluid brush. Right, this brush has some very simpler options. You can give it your brush sort of a shape, right, which you can't really do on the fluid brush has a lot more capabilities than that, but this is very simple, right? You can give it just sort of a shape. So if I change my shape to say, come on, to this, then when I paint, I'm painting with that, look of a brush. But the brush, the stroke that it leaves is still an outline and a fill, right? A line and a fill, right? You can set it smoothing up and down. There's also the capabilities of drawing, using an object drawing mode and all that. So it's a much more just simple brush than the fluid brush. You can actually apply different shapes to it. You can bring up and change, kind of bring this over here. It was off the screen. I can kind of change how that brush looks. I tend not to use this brush too much just because it's a little more simple than the fluid brush. Fluid brush feels like you're painting a little bit more. And then you've got a pencil tool, and the pencil tool really is what it's doing is it's just making a line. There's no stroke and fill or line and fill. It's just a line, right? It's whatever color the pencil has, but it is really good for just drawing straight lines, right? But you can't add depth and dimension to it like you could these, right? You're not going to have multiple points that you can kind of manipulate. It's just down the center, right? If that's what you need, you can use that. You can use the pencil, but you can't add thickness to, over the line over time, right? It's just one thickness. You can change that thickness. So if I go to Object, I'm going to select it. And if I go to Object, you can see there's a style. I can add a style to that line. I can change the width. Yep, don't know why it's, here, change it that way. If I change it to a regular line, right? And then I change the stroke, you can see that it gets bigger, right? But it doesn't change from start to finish. I can't make it thinner and thicker as I go through. So I can change the width profile here. I can do it like that if I want to. But again, I use the pencil kind of sparingly. I usually just kind of stick with a main brush because I'm brushing a lot of things. This will work for you if you need, something that's sort of right along one straight line, but you can't break it apart. I mean, there's a way you can kind of convert it, but so if you want to do it that way, you can do it that way. And then the next tool is a rectangle tool, which just gives me ability. I'm going to kind of clear things away here. And actually, this might give me a good chance since I'm doing this. I'm going to switch to a different layer. I'm going to move that layer up to the top. And I'm going to go to layer 3, which is right below layer 1. And I'm going to draw a box. And let's say I change its color to something like that. So I'm going to draw a box like this. And you'll notice that, first off, you'll notice that whatever I change the pencil to, this profile, it automatically chose that for the box that I drew. But also notice the box is going below everything else in the drawing. If I move layer 1 down below layer 3, right, you'll notice the box moves above. So that's a good way to kind of rearrange layers and kind of group things. When we start talking about animation, we're going to be using layers a lot more, right? So there's a box down below that. And that box is made up of points. just like with everything else. I can kind of manipulate those points, move those points around. I can even add new points, and I'll talk about that in a bit here. So the same thing, if I select and hold, you'll see there's a rectangle primitive tool, right, which makes sort of what they call rectangle primitive. I'll talk about that in a future video as well. It just makes a different type of object. Same thing here, there's an oval tool, right? I can make an oval, and then there is this polygon tool, right? What they call the poly star tool, right? I can select and drag that and get this poly star, right? And again, those are on this other layer. And if I go through here, I can hide that layer, right? The little eye hides the layer, right? So if I hide the second layer, I can kind of just see these shapes that I'm creating. And again, I can go to the sub-selection tool with any one of these, and it's, again, still just lines and fills, right? If I want to change this from a corner point to a curve point, all I have to do is hold down Option, and I select it and drag out these Bezier handles. So click and drag, and I can drag out the Bezier handle. So I can change that. I can manipulate that shape around, right? So that's rectangle, oval, and the polystar. There's also a line tool, which is pretty much like the pencil, except it just draws a straight line, right? I can't, as I keep drawing, I'm not drawing out like the pencil. I'm not drawing a shape like this. With the straight line, I'm drawing a straight line from start to finish, right? And it, again, uses the same, it's kind of like the pencil. It uses the same kind of options like the pencil, right? And then we have a text tool. We don't need it for any kind of drawing, but you could just, kind of click in and start typing, right? It's pretty simple to work with in that way. Next couple tools down, the next row down is erasing and filling and, sort of modifying things. So if these are sort of creation tools, these are selection, these are kind of creation tools. These are sort of modifying tools. So I can take the eraser and then erase over it. And again, it uses, this whatever shape that I had last selected. So I'm going to select a circle. Whoop. Select that circle. There we go. And then I can erase with that. If you're using a tablet like a Cintiq or any kind of digitizing tablet, you can turn the pen over and erase with that at any time. It's going to use whatever is set for the eraser. So if I'm kind of, drawing with a regular pencil or the fluid brush, right? And then I just flip the pen around and erase. It's going to use whatever settings I had set in this eraser. So if I change the size of it, right, and I'm in a fluid brush, you're going to see that eraser takes sort of that size, if that makes any sense. But I can also choose the eraser and erase sort of normally, right? And what it's doing is, again, it's converting it to little points along the way. So whenever I erase, it's erasing what's there and adding points. So even if I take the eraser and erase in the middle, when I select that, you're going to see there's points that I've erased in the middle, right? So it's not combining them, but it does kind of show through. So that's the eraser tool. And this one, there's two, again, whenever you see that little arrow, kind of that little corner piece on the icon, you're going to know that there's a tool below it. So right now it's the paint bucket tool. And if I choose the paint bucket tool and change a new color, and when I click in with this paint bucket tool, I'm going to color the fill with that. It will not do the outline, you'll notice, right? It's only the fill that's inside those shapes. If I click and hold on that icon, I go to the ink bottle, then I can change the color of the outline, right? So that is the outline. You'll notice wherever they touch, they're combining. Important thing to realize about Adobe Animate is whenever you move a shape or draw a shape over one another on the same layer, they're going to combine. So if I take this and I draw over, you're going to see that that is now combined with this shape. It's just how it works, right? If you choose the drawing mode, you could do that. But if I wanted to put something above it and not combine, I just put it on a different layer. So that's the ink bottle tool. And again, I can go to the edit toolbox. And if I wanted that to be separate, I can drag it over and then I can close this, right? And then it's closed, right? And then we have the ink dropper tool. And what the ink dropper tool is, let's say I have a shape over here that's got a different color and I want to pick that up. I just pick that up and you'll notice that it chose that as the color. So with the eyedropper tool, I can kind of pick up that color, and it's going to assign that color as what is now selected, and I can switch to a different tool and then paint and draw with that tool with those colors picked up. Right, so if let's say I have this and I want these colors to be slightly different, right? And then I switch back to the fluid brush. If I go to the eyedropper, select that, go back to the fluid brush, I then am painting and drawing with those colors, right? Well, hopefully that makes sense. All right, so that's the eyedropper tool. A couple other tools. This one is the hand tool. Whoop, I opened that. Let me close it. The hand tool underneath is a time scrub and rotation tool. Right now, the hand tool operates, like I said, with the space bar, where you can kind of move the palette around and kind of view it. It doesn't change how your final image is looking. It just moves it around so you can see different parts. If like you've zoomed in, you want to kind of see this part over here. Right? Again, it's the same as if you hold down the space bar no matter what tool. This tool right here is a zoom tool, so you can kind of click and zoom in. But you can also hold down Command if you're on a Mac and Control if you're on a PC and hit plus and minus, and it'll zoom in. So it'll also zoom into whatever you have selected, right? So if I have that selected, it'll zoom into that when I hit Control or Command plus or minus, and Command or Control 0 will bring it back to default, or you can just come up over here and say fit to window if you want. Right? A couple other tools that aren't over here that I like to use pretty regularly. I'm going to add these pen tools. I like to use the pen tools quite a lot, and I usually stick them over here because they're sort of modification tools. You can also stick them up here, because they can come across as creation tools. There are these other options you can add to them, but they're hotkeys to go between them, right? So I'm going to go ahead and close this. With that pen tool, if you hold down the option or the command or the control key on a PC, command on a Mac, control on a PC, you could select a point. Now, if I just hover over it with nothing, with no keys being held down, it gives me this minus sign, this pen tool with a minus sign, and I can delete points by doing that. Then if I hold down Option and I drag across, it works kind of like the sub-selection tool where I can drag out handles. And again, Command, I can select. You can see that it actually wants to turn on this bounding box, because then it'll also work as a scale tool, right? And I can move things around, right? Undo. And then, but if I hold down Command, I can drag it, and I move a point, I can move that point around, right? So plus, if I'm nowhere near a point, if you'll see a plus sign, and that gives me the ability to add new points. So it's a very quick and easy way to manipulate a shape. One thing about the plus tool is that I can't keep adding new points. It wants to kind of draw a connection. If I added one point, it wants to then add draw a connection between the two. So what I usually do is then go to just choose the sub-selection tool and go back to the pen tool, and then I can add another point. But you see, after I add one point, it wants to it wants to kind of draw a connection between the two. It wants to keep drawing that line, which I don't necessarily care for that, but I just make sure that I switch back and forth, and then I can add more points if I want to. But to just manipulate them, I can kind of drag them out. Again, I'm holding down Option here and dragging out Bezier handles to make a curve. If you hold down Option again and you click it, you can make it back to a corner point. So this is curve point. Clicking it again while holding Option makes it a corner point, right? If it adds new points, I can then just kind of get rid of them. Whoop. I just select over them and wait till I get the minus sign. You can also select one and hit the delete key, press the delete key. So there's a couple different ways to get rid of these points. So, but drag that out. Yep, there's the minus. Sometimes these points are pretty small, and I think that is kind of one sort of drawback from Adobe Animate. But it works pretty well. It sometimes it feels like you need a magnifying glass to see it. Anyway, that's a basic rundown of all the drawing tools and all, kind of how you create shapes and draw and erase and kind of combine to it. And so hopefully that helps you to kind of get a head start on that.